Howdy folks, this is Big Sam. Welcome back to episode 3 of Legends Never Die, The Secret History of the Mosin Nagant. Now, I was originally intending on making 2 separate and distinct videos, but given that we've already had so much backstory in episodes 1 and 2, I decided that we can actually just kind of shorten this a little bit and get both videos into this one. So what exactly are we talking about here today? Well, as a quick refresher, we've talked in episode 1 about the Model 1869 Russian Kernka, which is one of the granddads of the Mosin Nagant. And then we talked about the Model 1868 Berdan 1 rifle, which is the other granddad of the Mosin Nagant. Today we're talking about the dad of the Mosin Nagant, which is the Imperial Russian Berdan 2 rifle, which is what we have here. But this isn't just any Imperial Russian Berdan 2 rifle. As some of y'all know, we're talking about Austro-Hungarian stuff on the channel right now. And so, of course, we needed to take a look at an Imperial Russian Berdan 2 that was captured by the Austro-Hungarian Empire in World War I. That's what this rifle is. Now, that second bit about Austro-Hungarian Empire, we're going to get to in a little bit. But before we do, we need a little bit of backstory on what exactly this gun is and where it came from. So, really, our story picks up where episode 2 left off, which was when the Russian Empire adopted the Berdan 1 rifle in 1868. And this was a really revolutionary rifle. It was a single-shot breech-loading rifle. The first metallic cartridge center-fired breech-loading rifle that Colt ever produced, actually. And they made 30,000 of them, and it was looking pretty good. The Russians spent a lot of time in development of this rifle, and, you know, it's really hard to tell exactly how much direct influence Hiram Berdan had on the Imperial Russian Berdan 1 rifle. But it does appear that Gorlov and Gunius, who we talked about last time, had a significant role in this. And one of the reasons we believe that is because this rifle exists. You see, right around the time that this rifle was adopted, about a year later in 1869, Hiram Berdan actually went over to Europe because he was working on a prototype for another gun. And it's sort of weird because if Hiram Berdan's baby truly was the Berdan 1 rifle, you would have thought he would have just left it at that. Okay, the Russians adopted it, it's perfect. However, he immediately went to work on a totally different design. And to me, that says that Gorlov and Gunius really took off and kind of did their own thing with his original patent that was sort of derived from the Berdan 1, right? Or that the Berdan 1, rather, was derived from. Seems like they did a whole lot of work, and my opinion is that Hiram Berdan was a little bit jealous of all of that. And he wanted to kind of show the Russians that he could one-up their design. And oh, he did. So he actually went over to England land, where he worked with a company you may have heard of called BSA. And they actually produced a couple of prototypes of the Berdan 2. Now, the Berdan 2 is similar to the Berdan 1, and that it fires the same .42 caliber, necked down, metallic cartridge center-fired black powder round, an extremely accurate rifle, and an extremely accurate cartridge. However, the action's a little bit different, where the Berdan 1 was kind of at this weird trapdoor system. The Berdan 2 is a much more, I guess, it's much closer to early smokeless cartridge rifles, and the fact that it's actually a actuated bolt action rifle. It doesn't have locking lugs. Most black powder rifles around this time didn't have locking lugs. I mean, the bolt handle is really the locking surface, and that's pretty normal across most countries that adopted bolt action black powder rifles. So nothing too crazy there, but what was really fascinating about this rifle is just the sheer simplicity of it. You don't really have a lot going on here with the bolt. There's not that many moving parts. It's pretty easy to manufacture. And what's really cool about all of this is that it's quite reliable. And remember, this was one of the big things the Russians needed. They needed something that was reliable, right? They didn't have a ton of resources for money, or they didn't have it, and also they didn't have a ton of resources for actual machining and making these components. So they needed something that was easy to manufacture and was reliable in all these really horrible conditions that could last for a really long time. And that's what this rifle was. That's kind of what the Berdan 1 was as well. However, what was really important to note about the Berdan 2 over the Berdan 1, that it was found during trials when Hiram Berdan would finally take this rifle back to Russia after the prototypes were done, was the fire rate, okay? The Berdan 1 had a fire rate of approximately 18 rounds per minute, which really wasn't that bad considering the Russians not that long before were using muskets, and in a lot of cases, flintlock muskets. So 18 rounds a minute is pretty good. However, this guy, the Berdan 2, was capable of 28 rounds a minute. That is a significant increase in firepower. One of the reasons is because the actual process of actually loading the cartridge into the chamber in this rifle also cocks the action, whereas in the trapdoor, you have to close the trap, and then there's this separate action you have to pull back the cocking handle to charge the weapon. So this was just more natural, and it just lends itself to being able to shoot a lot faster, which is a good thing for a lot of reasons. Now, you got to imagine that Gorlov and Gunius were probably kind of triggered when Hiram Berdan kind of one-upped them, because they worked so long on that design, and then he just comes up and says, "Oh, by the way, you guys just adopted that, but take a look at this." And the Russian government loved this rifle. They loved it so much that this was the one that they actually then formally adopted. Now, they formally adopted the Berdan 1, but they only ended up producing about 30,000 units. Whereas with this guy, they ended up producing hundreds of thousands, probably even well over 1 million of these Berdan 2 rifles. Now, there were a couple of configurations, which we're not all going to look at today, but they did have a Dragoon variant and some interesting carbine variants as well, a Cossack variant. So a lot of different variants, kind of just like we see with Mosin's, but this was really the Berdan 1 that when you think, or excuse me, Berdan 2, when you think of it, you think of this, the long infantry rifle with these sort of massive barrel bands here. No escutcheons in the stock. Now you might notice these sling hangers. Well, these are not original to the Berdan 2. This is not part of the Russian design. We're going to get to that in a little bit later. But we first have to understand how the Russians were actually able to make this. Because remember, going back to episode 2, the Russians didn't have a lot of good infrastructure as far as, weapons factories that could really do a lot of this stuff. And they also had to outsource a lot of their components, especially barrels, from other countries. So how are they going to produce this in the scale of millions? Well, they probably wouldn't have been able to if it wasn't for a certain man that you know very well if you watched episode 1 by the name of Ludwig Nobel. Now, Ludwig Nobel was a Swedish businessman, entrepreneur, and an engineer, and he really was responsible for a lot of amazing stuff, but he basically, in my opinion, single-handedly reinvigorated Russian industry in a lot of aspects. Remember, he had this massive factory in St. Petersburg that produced all of these manufacturing tools and components that really allowed people in Russia to do things that they couldn't before. Really important guy. Well, it turns out as part of this whole process of sort of revitalizing Russia, remember, their weapons factories were all owned by the state. Well, the state actually then decided to lease out the Izhevsk factory to Ludwig Nobel in part. Now, this was really a good idea, because Ludwig Nobel is probably the only guy that could do really anything good with a weapons factory in Russia in the early 1870s. But not only did he do something good, he did something great. He really was, honestly, he was a humanitarian. He really cared about his workers, and this was important because when you reinvest in your workers and your workforce, you're really reinvesting in your own future as a business. And that's really what he did. He allowed people to have amazing training opportunities, housing opportunities that no one ever thought possible in Russia up until this time. Because remember, people are still, not that long ago, they're just coming out of serfdom, which is crazy to think about. So one of the things that Ludwig Nobel had to figure out was, how are we going to produce all of this steel? And so one of the things he was able to do was start producing actual barrels in Russia. And once he started doing this, this really was a game changer, because then you started really losing your dependence upon foreign countries for barrels, and it makes you a lot more capable of producing your own guns at that point. Now, he started producing these rifles in the 1870s at the Izhevsk factory, and as far as I can tell, the Izhevsk factory also produced the barrels that the other factories, the Sistroyetsk factory and the Tula factory, would use as well. Now, what also gets funny is you might have been familiar with the Russian oil industry down in Baku, Azerbaijan, which is still around today, by the way. But how did all that get started? Well, it turns out, this is a funny story, Ludwig Nobel had his brother Robert, he sent him down to the Caucasus in the early 1870s to look for forests where they could actually cut them down and use the wood from those forests to make stocks for these Berdan II rifles. He sent Robert down there with 25,000 rubles. So if you're sent on a mission to with 25,000 rubles to find a forest to produce Berdan II stocks, what do you do with that money? Of course, you buy an oil field. And that's, of course, what he did. And I don't think Ludwig turned out to be that mad about it, because it turned out he started sending Robert more money because he figured out this was actually a pretty smart thing. And Ludwig Nobel ultimately would end up producing some of the first oil pipelines and oil tankers that the world had ever seen. This guy was an overachiever. I mean, his brother was Alfred Nobel, the Nobel Prize guy. I mean, this was a family of overachievers, let's face it. So this thing has a really fascinating history, and because of Ludwig Nobel's work at the Izhevsk factory, not only was he able to produce these rifles in droves, but it really ended up paving the way about 20 years later for Russia to be able to produce a smokeless powdered repeating rifle, one that you might be able to guess what is based off of the name of this channel, which we're going to get to. So the Berdan II was in use in Russia from the early 1870s all the way theoretically to World War II. There are some folks around in World War II that still had these, although I don't think many people had these, and I don't know how much ammo was still left. But I've definitely seen some rumors of people using Berdan IIs during World War II, which is pretty crazy to think about. However, what we're really interested in here on the channel is World War I. Especially right now when we're trying to focus on the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and this is in fact the first rifle we're going to be talking about. So, where does this come into play in World War I, right? Because by World War I, the Russian army was using the Mosin Nagant everywhere. I mean, black powder rifles were a thing of the past even by World War I, right? Yes and no. It turns out that Russia, by World War I, had actually destroyed a lot of these rifles because they said, well, why do we need these? We have Mosins. Pretty good point. However, not all of them were destroyed. A lot of them were put into armories and actually were stored in areas like fortresses in strategic locations around Europe that Russia had control over. And so what you ended up happening was in World War I, especially in Russia, though, you had a massive shortage of guns. I mean, in fact, in World War I, at one point around 1915, the Russian army had what they claimed was about 1 million troops without guns, which is a problem if you want them to go to war, for instance. So one of the things that Russia was forced to do was pull out these things. Now, for a lot of people, if they even had one of these with some ammunition, they were doing pretty good. Russia even had to beg and plead places like France and Italy for old black-powdered Gras rifles, as well as some old black-powdered Vetterli rifles. So honestly, the Berdan 2 I tend to prefer over both of those. It's more simple. It's easier. I mean, you're more likely to have ammunition for this laying around in some armory somewhere in Russia than you are, Italian Vetterli or French Gras ammunition for sure. So this wouldn't have been the worst gun to have, but certainly wouldn't have been the best. I mean, a Mosin, still not nearly the best gun of World War I, probably one of the worst, but Mosin would still be better than this, right? It's all relative. There's always something worse you could have. This is better than a stick, for instance. A stick is better than nothing, probably. So you can kind of see how that works. But what ended up happening was you had a lot of guys in cases where they had to defend fortresses, and the fortresses, they had to start pulling out these things that were sitting down in the basements, gathering spider webs and whatnot. And so if you were lucky, you got one of these. If you were unlucky, you didn't get one, and you sat around waiting for your comrade who had one of these to die so you could take his gun. That happened quite a lot in the Eastern Front in World War I, unfortunately, especially on the Russian side of things. The situation was pretty bad. And in 1915, especially during what would be known as the Great Retreat, Russia lost large swaths of landmass and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of rifles. I mean, I think some estimates say several 100,000 rifles a month even they were losing. I mean, that's just hemorrhaging. I mean, that's really bad. And so, of course, one of the things that would happen is a lot of these arms would end up in the hands of the enemy. In this case, it would have been the Germans or the Austro-Hungarian Empire who were fighting against the Russians on the Eastern Front in World War I. So this rifle is actually one of those rifles. This rifle was captured by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and I'll show you how we know that here in a little bit. And, what would the Austro-Hungarian Empire have done with this Russian Berdan 1? Well, that's a really good question. Turns out the Austro-Hungarian Empire was pretty messed up during World War I as well. They were a lot of people would say incompetent, a lot of people would say that's being generous. They would end up having a large amount of weapons and supply shortages as well. So they were actually smart enough to realize this and not just totally discount weird, old, antiquated guns like this that they would capture from the enemy. They actually put these to use, kind of. How much of these were actually fielded, I don't think anybody really knows. In fact, I haven't even been able to find a picture of an Austro-Hungarian soldier during World War I with a Berdan 2 rifle. If I do, I will definitely let y'all know, however. My theory on these is that these were actually mostly thrown away into storage for a rainy day. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had a lot of just armories sitting around full of old captured weapons like this that if they needed to, they could just deploy. Now, theoretically, what would they have done with a rifle like this? Well, this would have been the perfect rifle for rear echelon operations, prison guards, prisoner camp guards, railroad guards, especially in the more inner regions of the empire. This would have been an ideal gun for that kind of situation. Especially, I think, the railroad guards, because, railroads are really important, because if you don't have a railroad, you're not able to rapidly supply your fronts, and World War I was a war of attrition. And so if you're, even for a little while, not able to resupply your front, the enemy can easily break through your lines, crush you, and totally defeat you. Kind of a scary concept. So railroad lines are extremely important, and you needed armed men to guard them, even if they weren't always armed with the latest and greatest equipment. So it's also very possible that a railroad guard used a rifle like this. I have not found too many pictures of Austro-Hungarian rear echelon railroad guards of the First World War, but again, that's something else to keep a lookout for. So I've done a lot of ranting now, but I think there's one more question that we need to talk about we're not going to be able to answer today, but it's one I want you to start thinking about. How? How did an Austro-Hungarian captured Berdan II get to my yard in America? That is actually a really interesting question. And a couple people have different theories on this. We're not going to be able to answer this question today, but until relatively recently, I was totally stumped on this as well. However, there's going to be a really amazing rifle that we're going to be taking a look at a little bit later here on the channel that really helps answer the question of how this rifle got to America. And there's actually two main ways that I've come up with of how this rifle got to America, and I think both are pretty equally likely, and both are extremely plausible. And one is, we can actually trace the history really well that we're going to get to, but no more spoilers for that episode. Okay. So enough ranting, let's take a closer look at some of the interesting quirks, features, and markings on this Berdan II rifle, because this is something that a lot of people dream about. An Austro-Hungarian captured Berdan II is a really weird, quirky, oddball gun that, again, really shouldn't even be in America, shouldn't even really exist anymore. These guns probably should have gotten mothballed or destroyed a long time ago. So let's take a closer look, guys. I think you're going to like this. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and start at the back here of this rifle. Now, first of all, we can see the cartouche right here. See if I can zoom in a little bit. Hopefully you can read that. It says 1884. And then we have this arrow that's facing upward. That arrow indicates that this was manufactured at the Sestruyetsk factory, of course, in 1884. If we look at the back here, you can see, kind of like Mosins, especially early Mosins, there's a serial number right here on the back of the butt plate. You basically never ever see Berdan IIs with really any numbers matching. This one is no exception. So just something to note there. Now we can see how the bolt operates. This one's missing a couple of screws, but that's really fine. I'm not planning on shooting this. Alright, so now we can just open up the action. And unlike the Berdan I, you don't have to cock the action manually, which is really handy. So as you see, it just opens like that. Just like any other bolt action rifle you've ever seen, we are clear. And then you'll notice the way this guy works is the sear, sort of like a Mosin, will catch the cocking piece back here at this point, and now I can throw the bolt forward, and now he's under spring tension, and I can fire. And that's basically it. That's the Berdan II. Very, very simple gun. You can see why the Russian Empire would have absolutely loved this rifle in the 1870s. And man, I'm really being invaded by deer right now. There's even a baby deer right there. Let me get my focus. There we go. Hey guys, how's it going? I don't think it's deer season, so they're happy campers. All right. I don't think anyone deer hunts with Berdan IIs also, so I don't think they're too worried about that. They probably did in the 1880s, but not so much today. All right, so let's look at our first interesting marking here. So, all right, let me get the lighting set up a little bit better for y'all. Right here. This is the best way to tell if a Berdan II was used by the Austro-Hungarian forces in World War I. you're going to see this AZF marking on the top of the back of the receiver. It's almost kind of under the rear sight. You almost have to raise the rear sight a little bit to see it, but you can see AZF marked there. And what's also rare about this marking is there are many Austro-Hungarian Berdan 2s that don't have this marking. But and there's ways like the sling swivels that we can tell they were probably used, but and the same with Mosins. A lot of Austro-Hungarian Mosins don't even have any markings really to indicate it, but it's really obvious that they were Austro-Hungarian used. So in these cases, it's really handy to actually see these markings because you don't always see it, and it does a lot to really authenticate the rifle. That's what you want to see there. Now, let's go back a little bit here and take a look at the sling swivel. So this is not original to the gun, this sling swivel. This is Austro-Hungarian adaptation right here. And we would see a similar thing in Mosins. We're going to be taking a look at some more interesting examples of Mosins, but this is pretty common for the Austro-Hungarians. What they would do in cases where there was no escutcheons or holes in the stock, they would actually just basically drill a hole through the bottom of the stock and insert some crude type of sling swivel. And that's what they've done here. So usually when you see a Berdan 2 with holes here, assuming it's not Ethiopian, which it's pretty easy to figure out if it's Ethiopian, that's in fact a lot of the Berdan 2s that are around here in America came out of Ethiopia, so this one's pretty nice. This is definitely not one of those. This rifle even still has some finish on it. We'll look at more of the markings here in a second, but whenever you see this is a really interesting indication that it could quite possibly be Austro-Hungarian used. And if we go up to the front here, we can see we've got our Sestroyetsk marked barrel band. You see the arrow, exactly the same type of marking you would see on Sestroyetsk Mosin, which is really cool. See it right there. And again, they would produce rifles all the way up to 1918. We can see this example even has a cleaning rod. Now, the bayonets were a little bit different on these because with Mosins, the bayonets would actually lock around the front sight base itself. On Berdan 1s and Berdan 2s, they had a separate side locking lug here on the barrel, and that's what they locked onto. Turns out this is kind of redundant, and this is one of the genius things about the Mosin is that they just said, we don't need that, we can just reuse this, and it makes your manufacturing process a little bit simpler. So that's one of the nice things they did with Mosins. I'm going to go ahead and turn the gun around here so it'll be easier to see in the light. Give me 1 second. All right, it's actually easier to turn the gun on its side to see this, so I'm going to go ahead and zoom in here. And there we go. So what do we have here? Well, we actually have the same year we see on the cartouche, although it's really hard to tell if this is the original stock. The butt plate doesn't match, so I tend to think it's not, so it's an interesting coincidence, but this is, it says 1884, and then that looks like an R. That's actually Russian, the Russian character for G, which is short for God, which is, of course, year. So that says year 1884. And then this word right here is the Sestroyetsky. So that's Sestroyetsk. This is Oruzheny, which is weapons. And this is Zavat, which is factory. And then here you have NO, which is serial, which means, all right, and here's the serial number. And here's your serial number, 9471, it looks like. And of course, if we go on here, we can see that the sight graduations, just like early M91 Mosin Nagant rifles, are actually in Arshins. This guy, the infantry rifles would go up to 15 Arshins here. And if I flip to the other side, which makes it a little bit easier to see, we can again see our AZF marking along with our PK proof commission marking, just like you'd actually see on Mosin Nagant rifles. We can see our serial numbers here on the bolt, as well as the back of the bolt here. So that about does it, actually. We can go ahead, since we're already here, and take a look at the other sling swivel. Let me get my mount working. Here we go. All right, here's our other sling swivel. We can see it's really the same song, different verse, essentially. We have a hole drilled in the stock with basically just a simple wire sling swivel inserted and bent into position there. So, not a whole lot going on there. Again, this is a really simple gun, but it's quite rare to see. Alright guys, so I really hope you've enjoyed taking a look at this amazingly cool and uncommon Austro-Hungarian captured Berdan II rifle. And you know, it's really wild to think that in just a span of around 10 years, the Russians went from largely having flintlock muskets to this, which honestly at the time was just about the most accurate military rifle the world had ever seen. What a turnaround for the Russians. And really, again, it couldn't have been possible without the help of a Swede by the name of Ludwig Nobel. And he did so much more for Russia than just this rifle, but he really helped basically get both this and the Model 1869 Kernka off the ground. And honestly, the moral of the story here, as we wrap up episode 3, is without Ludwig Nobel, we really likely wouldn't have a Mosin Nagant as we know it today. Without Ludwig Nobel's innovations, it's very unlikely that even by the 1890s, the Russians could have truly produced totally domestically the rifles that they needed. And we know that, as we'll see, even in the first few years, the Russians had to contract with the French to help them produce the Mosins that they wanted to, simply because their factories couldn't ramp up quickly enough. So imagine without Ludwig Nobel's innovations, where the Russian Empire would have been by 1891. We'll never know, but it wouldn't have been nearly the same world that we know. So really, a kudos where kudos are due. Thank you, Mr. Ludwig Nobel, because even though you never or didn't directly produce the Mosin Nagant, it wouldn't have existed without your help. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this series so far, where we've looked at the Model 1869 Kernka, the Berdan I, and the Berdan II. You can already go take a look at the extremely high-resolution pictures of the Kernka and the Berdan I on our website, mosinmuseum.com, and hopefully in the future we'll be able to get some really high-quality pictures of this Berdan II as well. So this was, our first video, sort of our introduction to Austro-Hungarian firearms. We're going to be looking at a lot of other wild stuff and some really cool Mosins. So make sure you guys subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Let me know if you guys have any prayer requests, and we'll see you next time.